The day of Pentecost had come. They were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them the ability.
그때 예루살렘에는 세계 여러 나라에서 온 경건한 유대인들이 많이 머물고 있었다. 하늘에서 난 바람 같은 소리를 듣고 걸려든 군중들은 각자 자기 나라 말로 제자들이 말하는 것을 듣고 어리둥절하였다. 그들은 모두 놀라 이상히 여기며 이렇게 말하였다. 지금 말하고 있는 저들은 다 갈릴리 사람들이 아니냐. 그런데 그들이 하는 말이 우리가 각자 태어난 나라의 말로 들으니 도대체 어떻게 된 것인가.
Partos, Medos y Elamitas, habitantes de Mesopotamia, de Judea y de Capadocia, del Ponto y de Asia, de Frigia y de Panfía, de Egipto y de las regiones de Libia cercanas a Cirene, visitantes llegados de Roma, judíos y proselitos, cretenes y árabes, todos por igual los oímos proclamar nuestra proclama de las maravillas de Dios. Desconcertados y perplejos, se preguntaban, ¿qué quiere decir esto? Otros se burlaban y decían, lo que pasa es que están borrachos.
非但和这一个使者张起告诉所有他人和一切住在耶路撒冷的人啊，这件事你们都知道，也刚才听我的话。你们想这些人是罪人，其实不是罪人，因为是我刚到时期，这正是先知约翰所说的。神说，在末后的日子，我要将我的灵浇灌凡有血气的，你们的儿女要说语言。你们的少年人要长天象，老年人要做你们。
Und auf meine Knechte und auf meine Mägde will ich in jenen Tagen von meinem Geist ausgießen. Sie sollen Weissagen. Und ich will Wunder tun oben am Himmel und Zeichen unten auf Erde. Blut und Feuer und Rauchdampf. Die Sonne soll in Finsternis und der Mond in Blut verwandelt werden, ehe der große Tag der Offenbarung des Herrn kommt. Und es soll geschehen. Wer den Namen des Herrn anrufen will, der soll gerettet werden.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. It's often said that there are two kinds of people. You know the two kinds of people? The kind of people that divide people into two kinds of people and people that don't. Right. But sometimes I think that there are two kinds of Christians when it comes to talking about the Holy Spirit. There are the kind of Christians who talk about the Holy Spirit all the time. In fact, it's almost all they ever talk about when they talk about God is, let me tell you about the Holy Spirit. And then there are the kind of Christians who almost never talk about the Holy Spirit. And Lutherans are usually the latter type of Christians. Yeah, you know, we confess the Holy Spirit every time that we recite the Creed. We baptize people in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. But usually the only time we really talk about the Holy Spirit is on days like today, on Pentecost, when we celebrate the gift of the Holy Spirit. So why is that? So I got to tell you, for me, it's often because whenever I get involved in conversations with that first kind of Christian, the people that always want to talk about the Holy Spirit, the conversation gets really weird, really fast. And while I know that God can work in all kinds of ways, often when I start talking to Christians that want to talk about the Holy Spirit, they start to tell me about the signs of the Spirit. And they start to imply that if I don't got those signs of the Spirit, I probably don't got the Spirit. Maybe I'm not a genuine Christian. And I realize that God can work in lots of ways in lots of people and does all kinds of things. But the thing that bothers me when I get involved in those kinds of conversations is that the signs of the Spirit that those folks are often talking about do not look like the signs of the Spirit that I see when I read the story of Pentecost. It is the case that many of both kinds of Christians think that the signs of the Spirit have to be things which are somehow weird and unusual. Sometimes we say things like, well, if it's really a sign of the Spirit, you've got to do something like speaking in tongues. So in the New Testament, speaking in tongues means that you're actually speaking a kind of a gibberish kind of language that nobody but somebody with a kind of a special gift of interpretation can understand. That's not actually what happens on the day of Pentecost. On the day of Pentecost, everybody hears in their own native language. But because the word tongue, both in Greek and in English, is used both for the thing in your mouth and the language that you speak, when the tongues of fire appeared over the heads of the disciples, we start to think, oh, they were speaking in tongues, even though that's not what happened. But, you know, the rush of the wind and the flames on their head, that's pretty weird and unusual. And a lot of times people think that a sign of the Spirit has to be like that. And then there are people who think that somehow a sign of the Spirit has to be something that is mystical and otherworldly. You know, I got transported out of this world. I heard some secret knowledge that God has given only to me and not to you. So I can tell you about it, but it was a secret that God told to me. There was a whole movement in the first century called Gnosticism, where people said that a real sign of the Spirit was that God told you a secret that was revealed to nobody else, and it was just for you. God can do whatever God wants, and maybe God can tell me or you a secret, but that's not necessarily a sign of the Spirit. But most often, when I start getting involved with people that talk about the signs of the Spirit, they really do end up being divisive conversations. They're conversations in which we talk about what the sign of the Spirit is working in our lives so that people can decide you got the Spirit or you don't. It really does divide people up. And that really is not a sign of the Spirit. Because while God can and does work in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of places, even though the day of Pentecost was filled with things that were kind of weird and unusual and different, the real signs of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost were things like the fact that the Spirit actually drew all kinds of people together. The Spirit drew folks who heard in their own native languages. All of these people that Jackson got stuck having to read in Spanish, all these names of these places where they came from, all these different parts of the Roman Empire, they spoke different languages. And they spoke different languages because they came from places where the people did not like each other. They really didn't. They would have never associated with each other. But somehow, those folks, because they heard in their own native languages, were drawn together. The Spirit broke down the walls that separated people and brought together folks who would never have associated with each other otherwise. That is a sign of the Spirit when people are drawn together. And they were drawn together because they wanted to actually be drawn closer to God. That's another sign of the Spirit that happens on Pentecost. The disciples go out and they start talking about God's amazing deeds of power. They speak about God in ways that people say, wow, I'd like to hear more about this. They're drawn by God's amazing deeds. You notice it doesn't say that they got out there and they spoke about God's anger or God's judgment, or how God was giving people one last chance to straighten up and fly right, or else. They spoke about God in ways that people said, oh, you know what, I may not have given God much thought my entire life, but that's interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. And when people are drawn closer to God, that is a sign of the Spirit. And maybe the sign of the Spirit that's most important in this story, the one that often gets most overlooked, is that the disciples, when they decided to go out and start talking to people, They actually didn't decide to go out and start talking to people. They were just kind of pushed by the Spirit out of the house, and they were actually kind of just talking to each other about God's mighty deeds. And God did something really incredible, even though the disciples had absolutely no agenda. They had no plan. They had no thought that somehow they were going to go out and save the world for Christ. They just went and did what they felt God was calling them to do at that moment in time. It's interesting that something like 3,000 people became believers, the book of Acts says, because of this event. But that was as surprising to the disciples as it was to the people on the street, because they had absolutely no agenda. And when people are able to serve God without having any agenda, any self-serving purpose, any self-serving motive, even if it's to surround yourself with other people who say, yes, I agree with you, that's a sign of the Spirit. Those were the real signs of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost. And I think that's an important lesson for us to remember, especially because Pentecost always around here falls very close to the Feast of Yard Sale. And lots of people ask questions, and it's a good question to ask, to say, you know, what are we going to do to try to share God's love with all kinds of different people who come here? People who are very different from us, people who speak languages that we can't speak, people who, frankly, we know would never darken the door of a church except for the fact that, you know, we're having yard sale. And so people are looking for exactly the right words to say. They're looking for exactly the right things to do. They're wondering what's the exact right balance between talking about our faith and about God and just kind of leaving the people alone and letting them be. What's the right thing to do? Well, frankly, if we want to do that, we've got to be like the disciples. And that is to say, we don't think about what the right words are. The disciples didn't ask what the right words were. They just talked. And they let people hear in their own language. They did what God called them to do. They didn't have a preconceived plan. And I think that for us, the most important thing we can do, if we want to share God's love, if we want to see the action of the Holy Spirit working among us, if we want to be instruments of the Holy Spirit in other people's lives, then we got to just sort of be like those disciples. And that means that we got to be people who simply talk about the great things that God is doing in our own lives without trying to find the right theological language. Because if you're looking for the right theological words to speak to people, you will find the wrong ones. The right theological words are not to use theological words when you talk to people usually about God. Speak to people in their own language doesn't just mean use the actual, you know, French or German or Korean or Chinese or some language that they speak, but it means talk to people in language they can understand, in language they can relate to. Be people who are willing to actually just do what God is calling you to do, going about your everyday life at yard sale as though you were going about your everyday life at home or at work or any place else. Because it is often the fact that the signs of the Spirit are most seen by us and through us when we're simply people who go about doing the work God calls us to do without any agenda, just like those disciples who ended up being great instruments of God in the lives of others, because most of all, they walked out into the world without any divisive agenda, without any thought of who they were going to save, and without any thought more than simply doing what God called them to do at any given moment.